The rain fell in sheets that November evening in 1962, turning the streets of Harlem into rivers of reflected neon and streetlight. Detective Marcus Webb sat in his unmarked sedan outside the Red Rooster on Lenox Avenue, watching shadows move behind fog windows. He'd been on this stakeout for 3 weeks now, part of a federal task force that seemed to have more interest in one man than in solving actual crimes. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Everyone called him Bumpy. Webb had heard the stories since he was a kid growing up in the Bronx. His uncle used to speak about Bumpy in hushed tones, the way you'd talk about a force of nature rather than a man. Now, sitting in this cold car with his coffee growing lukewarm and his notes piling up, Webb was beginning to understand why the FBI had devoted an entire floor of file cabinets to one Harlem kingpin. The manila folder on his passenger seat bore a stamp in red ink, Declassified. Inside were documents that painted a picture far more complex than the street legend suggested. Surveillance reports dating back to 1952. Wiretap transcripts. Informant testimonies. Photographs taken from rooftops and through restaurant windows. The Bureau had been watching Bumpy Johnson for over a decade, and what they'd found was both exactly what they expected and nothing like it at all. Webb opened the folder again, though he'd already memorized most of its contents. The first page was a summary report typed on an old Remington, the letters slightly uneven, some darker than others where the typist had struck the keys with particular emphasis. Subject demonstrates unusual pattern of community engagement inconsistent with typical organized crime profiles. It read, Johnson maintains strict code prohibiting drug sales to minors and has been observed mediating disputes between rival factions to prevent violence. Paradoxically enforces order and territory while simultaneously operating outside legal frameworks. Webb had underlined that passage 3 times. It captured something essential about the man he'd been following, something that made this assignment different from any other in his 15 years on the force. The first time Webb actually saw Bumpy in person was on a Tuesday afternoon. The surveillance photos hadn't prepared him for the reality. Johnson moved through the streets of Harlem like a mayor on election day, stopping to shake hands, bending down to talk to children, pressing folded bills into the palms of elderly women coming out of church. He wore an immaculate gray suit despite the heat, his signature fedora tilted at an angle that managed to be both casual and authoritative. Webb followed at a distance, camera ready, though he felt increasingly foolish documenting what appeared to be simply a well-dressed man running errands. Bumpy stopped at a fruit stand, examined the apples with genuine interest, paid for a bag, and handed half of them to a group of kids playing stickball in the street. He paused outside a barbershop, exchanged word with the owner that made both men laugh. He helped a woman carry her groceries up 4 flights of stairs in a walk-up on 135th Street. This is your notorious crime boss. Webb's partner, a young agent named Coleman Fresh from Quantico, had asked with obvious skepticism, but Webb had been reading those files. He knew what Coleman didn't yet understand. The man they were watching contained multitudes. The same hands that had fought their way out of poverty in prison, that had dealt with rivals in ways the reports only hinted at with clinical language about territorial disputes resolved, were the same hands now helping Mrs. Henderson with her shopping bags. The declassified files revealed something the public never knew. In 1958, when a teenage girl named Sarah Washington went missing from her apartment on 125th Street, it was Bumpy Johnson who organized the search. The FBI surveillance team, thinking they were about to document some criminal conspiracy, instead found themselves watching as Johnson mobilized every street corner, every business owner, every set of eyes in a 20-block radius. The reports noted with obvious surprise that he'd personally walked the streets for 72 hours straight. Subject did not sleep, ate minimally, refused all business meetings, Special Agent Harrison's report stated. When the missing girl was found in a basement 3 blocks from her home, held by a transient unknown to Subject, Johnson personally delivered her to her family. Subject was observed embracing the girl's mother, both parties visibly emotional. No monetary exchange occurred. This behavior pattern requires further analysis. Further analysis. That phrase appeared 47 times across the files. The Bureau couldn't quite figure out how to classify a man who existed outside their neat categorical boxes. Webb found himself thinking about that phrase late one night as he transcribed a conversation he'd recorded earlier that day. Bumpy had been sitting in a booth at Small's Paradise, and the wire they planted in the ceiling fixture had picked up every word. You want to know the difference between power and respect? Bumpy's voice came through clear and measured. Power is what you take. Respect is what you earn. Any fool with a gun has power for about 5 minutes. But respect? That takes a lifetime, and you can lose it in a moment. The man he was speaking to, identified in the files as James Jimmy Jazz Peterson, had asked about expansion into new territory, about pushing into areas controlled by the Italian families downtown. Bumpy's response had been instructive. We're not conquerors, Jimmy. We're custodians. Every block we control, we have a responsibility to. You understand? These aren't territories. They're neighborhoods. People live here. Children play here. This isn't some game of chess where we sacrifice pawns. These are real people with real lives. Coleman, listening to the recording later, had scoffed. It's an act he's playing to the audience. But Webb wasn't so sure. He'd been going through the older files, the ones from the 40s and early 50s. He'd found arrest records from Bumpy's younger days, the lean years when he'd first come up from South Carolina. Theft, assault, armed robbery. The progression was documented with bureaucratic precision. Each arrest another line item in a life that seemed destined for violence and early death. What changed? That question haunted Webb as he assembled the timeline. The files showed a gradual evolution, a reshaping of tactics and philosophy that coincided with Bumpy's time in Alcatraz. In the prison correspondence logs, heavily redacted but still partially legible, were letters between Johnson and various figures, including a few that suggested he'd been reading extensively. Philosophy, history, political theory. Subject is checked out following volumes from prison library. One report noted, Machiavelli's The Prince, Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk, various works by Marcus Garvey. Correctional staff report subjects spend significant time in library, often discussing books with other inmates, a different kind of education than the streets had provided. Webb could trace in the reports the subtle shift from pure survival to something more strategic, more philosophical. The Bumpy Johnson who came out of prison in 1963 was not the same man who'd gone in. The surveillance photos from that period told their own story. Webb spread them across his kitchen table one night, arranging them chronologically. In the early ones, Bumpy's face was harder, his posture aggressive, his interactions transactional. But as the years progressed, something softened. Not weakness, but a kind of expansion, as if he discovered that strength could take forms other than intimidation. There was a series of photos from outside the Hotel Teresa, Harlem's proudest landmark. They showed Bumpy in conversation with various community leaders, preachers, business owners, activists. The notes attached to the photos identified some of them. Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., activist Malcolm X in the early days before his break with the Nation of Islam, jazz musicians whose names were household words. Subject appears to serve as informal mediator and liaison between various community factions. The accompanying report stated, while maintaining criminal enterprise, Johnson has cultivated relationships across legitimate community organizations. This dual positioning makes traditional prosecution strategies difficult. Difficult was an understatement. Webb had watched 3 different assistant U.S. attorneys try to build cases against Johnson, only to see potential witnesses suddenly develop amnesia or, more often, simply refuse to cooperate. It wasn't fear or not just fear. There was something else operating, a loyalty that ran deeper than self-interest. He saw it himself one afternoon in Marcus Garvey Park. A young man, barely 20, was dealing drugs near the playground. Bumpy had appeared seemingly from nowhere, his 2 associates flanking him like shadows. Webb watched through binoculars from a building across the street, camera ready. What happened next wasn't what he expected. No violence. No threats. Bumpy spoke to the young dealer for perhaps 5 minutes. Webb couldn't hear the words, but he could see the body language. The young man's defensive posture gradually relaxing. Bumpy placing a hand on his shoulder. One of the associates writing something down, handing it to the dealer. Later, through informant reports and pieced together accounts, Webb learned what had happened. Bumpy had told the young man that if he was going to sell poison, he'd have to answer to the community, and the community's judgment would be harsh. But if he wanted work, legitimate work, there was a loading dock job at a warehouse on 8th Avenue. The piece of paper had been the foreman's name and a note of introduction. He gave him a choice. Webb's informant, a bartender who'd witnessed similar scenes, explained. That's what Bumpy does. He gives people choices. You can keep making bad decisions, but then you're on your own. Or you can try another path, and he'll help you find it. Most people take the help. The files contained dozens of similar accounts, buried in surveillance reports that were supposed to document criminal activity, but instead kept stumbling across something that looked uncomfortably like community organizing. Bumpy funded scholarship programs, though the money's origins were never quite documented in ways that would survive legal scrutiny. He settled disputes between landlords and tenants, usually in ways that favored the tenants. He organized food drives during harsh winters, medical clinics in buildings that officially were just social clubs. How do we prosecute this? Coleman asked one day after reviewing a week's worth of surveillance that showed Bumpy doing everything except obvious crime. The guy's running a protection racket, sure, but half the time he seems to be actually protecting people. Webb didn't have an answer. The complexity was the point. Bumpy Johnson had created a role for himself that existed in the spaces between legal categories. Yes, he ran numbers. Yes, he took cuts from various operations in his territory. Yes, there were darker aspects to his business that the files only hinted at in vague language about enforcement actions and territorial maintenance. But he also did things that city government had failed to do. He kept the streets safer than the police could. He provided a kind of rough justice that, while extra-legal, addressed real grievances that the formal legal system ignored. He created economic opportunities in a community that the broader economy had abandoned. The FBI's confusion was evident in the evolving language of the reports. Early surveillance summaries used straightforward criminal terminology, but as the years progressed and the picture became more complex, the language became more uncertain, more hedged, more filled with qualifications and contradictions. Subject exhibits characteristics of both criminal leadership and community advocacy. One report from 1960 noted, traditional analytical frameworks insufficient for a complete profile. Recommend continued observation to determine primary motivations and ultimate objectives. Webb found himself obsessing over that question. What were Bumpy's ultimate objectives? Was this all an elaborate long game, building community support as a shield against prosecution? Or was there something genuine operating alongside the criminal enterprise, some authentic commitment to Harlem that existed in tension with the illegal means of supporting it? He got closer to an answer one night when a wire picked up a conversation between Bumpy and his wife, Mamie. They were in their apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, and the intimacy of the moment made Webb feel like a voyeur, but he listened anyway, because that was his job. Sometimes I wonder what we're building here. Bumpy's voice, quieter than usual, contemplative. All this weight we carry, all these choices. What's the ledger going to read when it's all tallied up? Mamie's response was indistinct, but Bumpy's continued soliloquy was clear. I came up from nothing, baby, from less than nothing. And I did things, terrible things, to survive, to build something. And now we have something, and I look around at these streets, at these people, and I think, what am I responsible for? Just my own survival? Just our prosperity? Or is there something more? A pause. The sound of ice in a glass. My daddy used to say that a man's measure isn't in what he takes in the world, but what he leaves behind. I've taken plenty. Maybe it's time to think about what gets left behind. Webb played that recording 3 times before filing it away. It didn't fit the profile of a simple criminal. It suggested something more complex, a man wrestling with questions of legacy and responsibility, trying to reconcile the violence of his methods with the genuine care he seemed to have for his community. The Declassified Files revealed something else that surprised Webb: Bumpy's political consciousness. The wiretaps picked up conversations about civil rights, about the changing political landscape, about the tension between nonviolent resistance and more militant approaches to racial justice. In one particularly revealing exchange with Malcolm X at a restaurant on Lenox Avenue, recorded in March 1963, Bumpy laid out a philosophy that straddled multiple worlds. The peaceful protesters, they're doing necessary work. Bumpy said, they're changing hearts and minds, showing the world the injustice. But hearts and minds don't mean much when a man can't feed his family, when he can't walk his own street safely. There's a place for both approaches, the visible and the invisible, the legitimate and the necessary. Malcolm's response was characteristically sharp. You justify your lifestyle, Bumpy, dressing up crime as revolutionary action. Maybe I am, or maybe I'm recognizing that in a system that's stacked against us, survival itself is resistance. Every black business that thrives, every family that stays housed and fed, every kid who makes it to adulthood despite everything designed to kill him, that's victory. And if the means aren't always clean, well, show me any revolution that was. The debate continued for over an hour, ranging across topics that the surveillance agents noted with obvious surprise. This wasn't a conversation they expected to record between a crime boss and a political radical. It was sophisticated, nuanced, engaged with ideas and principles in ways that complicated easy categorization. Webb saw it himself one afternoon when he followed Bumpy to a meeting at a church basement on 132nd Street. The gathering was ostensibly a community organizing session, planning responses to a new development project that threatened to displace longtime residents. Bumpy sat in the back, mostly listening, occasionally offering quiet observations that seemed to carry unusual weight. When a young activist started arguing for militant direct action, suggesting they should physically prevent the demolition crews from entering the neighborhood, Bumpy spoke up. Courage is admirable, he said, his voice carrying easily through the room despite not being raised. But martyrdom without strategy is waste. You want to fight this thing? You need lawyers, good ones. You need media attention that puts the city on the defensive. You need documented evidence of your residency and investment in this community. You need political pressure from multiple angles. And yes, maybe you need bodies on the line when the time comes. But that's the last resort, not the first move. He'd pulled out a folded piece of paper, passed it to the activist. 3 lawyers who will take this pro bono. 2 reporters who cover housing issues for Papers That Matter. And an envelope that'll be delivered to your organizing committee with enough money to print flyers and rent halls for the next 6 months. Use it wisely. The surveillance report on that meeting noted, Subject appears to be funding community activism while simultaneously operating illegal enterprises in same community. Relationship between these activities unclear. Possible reputational management strategy, though level of genuine engagement suggests additional motivations. The files were full of these qualifications. These admissions that the standard criminal profile didn't quite fit. Bumpy Johnson was supposed to be predictable, explicable through the usual frameworks of greed and power-seeking. Instead, the more they watched, the more complex the picture became. Webb started compiling his own notes, separate from the official reports. He called it the Johnson Paradox and filled pages with observations that didn't fit anywhere in the formal documentation. The way Bumpy personally visited the families of men who'd worked for him and been arrested, making sure they were cared for, the chess games he played with kids in the park, using the moves to teach strategy and patience, the quiet conversations with teachers at the local schools, asking about particular students, which ones needed encouragement or intervention. There was one incident that Webb couldn't get out of his mind. A young woman brutally assaulted by a man who thought he was untouchable because of his connections. She'd reported it to police, but the investigation went nowhere. Witnesses developed amnesia. Evidence disappeared. The system failed her spectacularly. 3 weeks later, the man turned himself in, confessing to everything. The surveillance reports noted that Bumpy had met with a man twice in the interim. Conversations held in locations where no wire could pick up the words. Whatever was said in those meetings, the result was a full confession and ultimately a conviction. How did you do it? Webb's informant asked Bumpy later, in a conversation that was recorded. What did you say to him? Bumpy's response was chilling in its simplicity. I explained that there are 2 kinds of justice in this world. The kind you get in a courtroom and the kind you get in the streets. I gave him a choice about which kind he wanted to face. He chose wisely. It wasn't legal. It certainly wasn't proper procedure, but it was effective, and it brought a kind of closure that the formal system had failed to provide. The files contained dozens of similar stories, a shadow justice system operating parallel to the official one, sometimes achieving results the official system couldn't or wouldn't. As Webb dug deeper into the declassified files, he found something that changed his entire understanding of the case. In a heavily redacted document from 1961, there were references to Bumpy serving as an FBI informant, not about his own operations, but about others, competitors who'd violated codes that Bumpy considered inviolable. The document was fragmentary, with whole paragraphs blacked out, but the outline was clear. Bumpy had provided information that led to the arrest of a sex trafficking ring operating out of Brooklyn. He'd given the Bureau intelligence about a group planning to flood Harlem with heroin cut with strychnine. He'd identified corrupt police officers who were shaking down small businesses beyond even the usual graft. Subject maintained specific ethical boundaries regarding acceptable criminal activity, the document noted. While engaged in illegal enterprises, Johnson demonstrates consistent opposition to activities involving exploitation of minors, trafficking, and adulterated narcotics. Subject appears to view his role as maintaining order and boundaries within criminal ecosystem rather than pure profit maximization. The revelation complicated everything. Bumpy wasn't just a criminal who did some good things on the side. He was something more complex, someone who created his own moral framework that existed outside both legal and illegal norms, cherry-picking from both while adhering fully to neither. Webb showed this document to Coleman, who stared at it for a long time before speaking. So what is he? Criminal? Informant? Community leader? All of the above. I don't think he fits our categories, Webb said. I think he's something we don't have a name for. The surveillance continued through the fall and into winter. Webb watched Bumpy navigate his world with increasing fascination, seeing patterns that the raw data of the reports had obscured. There was a method to it, a consistency of principle, if not a legality. Bumpy didn't just run criminal enterprises. He regulated them. He set standards and enforced them ruthlessly. No drugs sold to kids. No violence that endangered bystanders. No one preyed on the weakest members of the community. Break these rules, and you answer to Bumpy. And that was a reckoning no one wanted to face. At the same time, he invested constantly in the community's infrastructure, both physical and social. Money flowed from illegal enterprises into legitimate and semi-legitimate ventures. The jazz club that showcased young talent. The scholarship fund that sent dozens of kids to college. The informal bank that provided loans to people no legitimate institution would touch, at rates that were usurious by law but generous by street standards. He's built a state within a state, Webb wrote in his private notes, complete with taxation, regulation, social services, and a justice system. It's feudalism, but with a social conscience. It's criminal enterprise, but with community benefit. I don't know how to prosecute this, because I'm not sure I could explain to a jury what exactly the crime is beyond the obvious technical violations. The turning point came in December. A group from Brooklyn, emboldened by apparent weaknesses in Bumpy's organization, may have moved into Harlem. They were violent, aggressive, and they didn't care about the unwritten rules that had kept a certain order in the streets. The FBI watched with anticipation, thinking this might finally give them the evidence they needed. A gang war, bodies in the street, clear criminal conspiracy charges. Coleman was excited, seeing the culmination of months of surveillance work. But it didn't play out that way. Bumpy's response was surgical, strategic, and surprisingly nonviolent. He called meetings with community leaders, warning them of the danger. He coordinated with police, anonymously providing information about the Brooklyn Cruise movements. He organized street-level resistance, shopkeepers refusing service, residents creating a network of watchers that made the invaders feel exposed and vulnerable. When violence did occur, it was limited, targeted, and ended quickly. The Brooklyn crew lost 3 operations in one night, arrested by police acting on anonymous tips. Their leader found himself facing federal charges for interstate trafficking. Within a week, they'd retreated, and Harlem returned to its normal rhythms. Subject achieved territorial defense without major violence or disorder. The surveillance report stated with obvious puzzlement. demonstrated sophisticated understanding of information warfare and community mobilization. Criminal objectives achieved largely through coordination with legal authorities and community institutions. Methodology inconsistent with typical gang conflict patterns. Webb sat in his car that night, watching Bumpy walk the streets in the aftermath. There were no victory celebrations, no displays of dominance. Instead, Bumpy moved from shop to shop, checking on people, asking about damage, offering assistance. It looked less like a crime boss consolidating power, and more like a mayor surveying his constituency after a crisis. The final document Webb found in the Declassified files was dated January 1963, just a few months before his current surveillance began. It was a psychological profile commissioned by the Bureau and written by a psychiatrist who'd reviewed all the surveillance materials without ever meeting Bumpy directly. The conclusion was remarkable in its honesty. Subject presents a complex psychological profile that resists simple categorization, demonstrates high intelligence, sophisticated social understanding, and consistent if unconventional ethical framework. Criminal behavior appears motivated less by pure material gain than by desire for autonomy, community control, and implementation of personal vision of social order. Subject appears to view legal and illegal activity as arbitrary distinctions less important than results achieved and principles upheld. Has created a hybrid role combining elements of criminal leadership, community advocacy, and informal governance. Traditional prosecution strategies likely to fail due to subjects' genuine community support and sophisticated understanding of institutional weaknesses. Recommendation. Subject represents new type of criminal leadership that traditional law enforcement frameworks are not designed to address. Suggests need for revised strategies that account for complexity of subject's role and community relationships. Webb closed the file as dawn broke over Harlem. In a few hours, he'd need to type up his report, add another layer to the endless documentation of Bumpy Johnson's life and activities. But he knew now that no amount of surveillance would truly capture what he'd spent these months observing. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal, yes. The law was clear about that. But he was also something else, something the FBI's categories couldn't quite contain. He was a community leader who'd risen through illegal means, a businessman whose business happened to be crime, a protector whose protection came at a price, a man who'd looked at a system that had failed his community and built his own system in its place, using whatever tools came to hand. As Webb watched the sun rise over the streets Bumpy had walked, fought in, and ultimately shaped, he thought about what justice meant in a place where the official justice system had long ago abdicated its responsibilities. He thought about the line between law and order, and whether they were always the same thing. He thought about a man who'd built an empire from nothing, and used in ways both destructive and constructive, criminal and communal. The files would continue to grow. Bumpy's legend would endure long after his death. But sitting there in his car with the morning light spreading across Harlem, Webb understood something the reports would never quite capture. Bumpy Johnson was Harlem's answer to a question the rest of America had refused to ask. What happens to a community when it's abandoned by the systems that are supposed to serve it? What kind of leaders emerge when the conventional paths to power are blocked? How do people create order and opportunity when the official sources of both are denied? The answer was complicated, morally ambiguous, and impossible to reduce to simple judgments of right and wrong. The answer was a man in a fedora walking these streets like he owned them, because in all the ways that mattered to the people who lived here, he did, not through violence or fear, though those were part of his arsenal, but through presence, through consistency, through a kind of rough caring that acknowledged people's dignity even as it operated outside the law. Webb started his car as the city came alive around him. He'd write his report, add to the files, continue the surveillance. But he knew now that they'd never truly understand Bumpy Johnson by watching from the outside. You have to walk these streets yourself, feel their rhythms, understand their needs and frustrations. You have to recognize that sometimes the people who break the law and the people who serve the community aren't two different groups, but the same person wearing different hats, navigating impossible contradictions with whatever grace and grit they can muster. The files would be sealed again someday, classified for another generation of analysts to puzzle over. They'd read the reports, see the surveillance photos, listen to the wiretap recordings. And they'd ask the same questions Webb was asking now. confronting the same paradoxes, wrestling with the same moral complexities. Because Bumpy Johnson wasn't a problem to be solved. He was a mirror reflecting back the contradictions of society that created men like him by denying legitimate paths to power and protection, then condemned them for finding illegitimate ones. He was both symptom and treatment, problem and solution, criminal and savior, all at once, all the time, walking the tightrope between worlds with a grace that looked easy but cost everything. As Webb drove away through streets that were just beginning to bustle with morning activity, he carried with him the weight of understanding something that the files could document but never quite explain. Harlem had built Bumpy Johnson as much as Bumpy Johnson had built Harlem, and the relationship between them was too deep, too complex, too rooted in shared history and mutual need to be captured in surveillance reports and FBI classifications. The Bumpy Johnson Files would remain, growing thicker with each passing year. But the real story, the true story, lived in these streets, in the memories of people who'd known him, feared him, loved him, depended on him. It lived in the contradictions he embodied, the impossibilities he made real, the moral complexities he navigated with fierce intelligence and uncompromising will. And that story, Webb knew, would never be declassified because it had never been secret. It had always been there, written in the architecture of Harlem itself, in the patterns of power and protection, crime and community, that defined life in a place where the rules were different because they had to be, where men like Bumpy Johnson emerged not as aberrations but as inevitable responses to impossible circumstances. The files would tell one story, the streets told another, and the truth, as always, lived somewhere in between.